Alright guys, TacticalRab back again today. Hope you're doing well and enjoying your day so far. Not long at all after the CDL blueprints arrived into the game for the Vaznev, Ghosty has raised the question as to whether the Vaznev is actually slightly too powered compared to the TAC or the SCAR, whatever you want to call it. Is the Vaznev the god gun in this game, and should it be gentleman's agreemented down the line? And even if it's not banned for this season, as it probably won't be, what about next year? What changes are we going to see to the meta? Is it time for the Vaznev to go, and maybe the VEL or the MP7 as people are calling it, to come into the game instead? Very much enjoyed to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Plenty to discuss. Firstly, I thought this was hilarious, right? The original Rokkr races was this video here where JoeDeceives' form was on full display. I've probably shared this for you guys at least a couple of times. But yeah, they were back in the same location here and they were running it once again. So this time they had Joey versus Afro. I know that people said that Afro was like running like a Raheem Sterling, which I thought was pretty entertaining, but he still gets the job done without too much difficulty here against JoeDeceives, who's probably not the most challenging man to beat in the world. And then we had Cammy MVP, and Cammy made it hard for himself actually. He stumbles at the start, and it got a bit suspect for a second, but you know, there was just too much distance for Joe to make up the gap. And then the Bance one is funny, because Bance starts way behind him, and it's basically just jogging the whole way. And yeah, Bance is, I mean, he's 6'3", he's going to be relatively rapid, I guess. So anyway, there you go, part 2 of Rokkr Races is officially complete, and Joey is, what, over 4, I guess, so far. Also wanted to mention Scump and Method's opinions on the Seattle Surge roster right now, because they come up with their thin ice segment, and often the teams that are on thin ice end up improving, but usually it's like something of a regression to the mean thing, right? If you guys know about that concept in statistics, where a you know, a team or a player that is performing particularly badly is more than likely just in a bit of a slump, and therefore should theoretically be expected to return to a slightly higher level. Whether that level is going to be high enough if Surge do bounce back a little bit to actually compete for anything, because it felt like they were bouncing back a bit, the Seattle Surge, but then it really collapsed for them. So I'll share the clip on what they have to say on that. I did want to mention as well, because they interviewed Beans here on the kind of 1v2 thing or whatever it's called, about the sound EQ situation. He gave his thoughts on it, and I know there's been some discussion from Parasite on the reverse sweep about what if they could just, the teams decide to effectively blacklist the Boston Breach for doing this stuff. He talks about the cowardice and everything involved, and fundamentally I imagine Rokkr probably will be blacklisting Boston. I don't imagine they're going to be scrimming anytime soon based on the grudge they're holding over this. I think it was the same story with OpTic in Minnesota, right? When the SAE drama went down, that OpTic decided to like not scrim them for a while, or there was something Dashy mentioned where Minnesota needed a warm-up scrim and OpTic just didn't give it to them. So just petty stuff like that. But you know, between those two teams that have the beef as a result of this, they probably won't be on great terms, but the other teams probably won't care too much. There is an argument to say how much would you learn scrimming Boston, which is maybe an interesting debate, but I think blacklisting them is a bit of a predicament really, because there's nothing they can necessarily change now to get out of the blacklist, right? So the idea would be, back in the day, let's say one team was snaking, right? So this is the theory during Cold War, that the teams would be like, oh, Cellium keeps snaking, we're going to blacklist FaZe and never play them in scrims. Now, because FaZe were the best team, pretty much, right? I mean, they were the entire season. Teams did want to scrim them and then, you know, said, all right, whatever, we'll put up with Cellium snaking just so we can practice against the best team. But in theory, they could have said, no, we're not going to practice you, FaZe, until Cellium stops snaking. Whereas in this case, they've done the damage, and right now they're still playing their scrims with sound EQ on, as everybody is. So there's nothing they can change to get out of the blacklist if it was to occur. So more than likely, that's not going to happen. But just wanted to share the perspective on the Seattle Surge and what they might be looking for going forwards.
So I have a couple stats. So since beating FaZe 3-0 on 4/15, their control is 2-2, or 2-3 actually, versus 18-11 before. So their control's starting to slip. And honestly, really all their game modes are, besides Search and Destroy. 3-4 in Search at 42% versus 12 and 25 before. So we've been talking about Seattle, how their Search and Destroy has been improving, and they've finally been getting some wins under their belt. And honestly, that was their only really flaw before that, was their Search and Destroy, because it was so bad.
Really bad.
They were on like an 11-12 game Search and Destroy losing streak, which I think they tied the record. But they started to fix their Search and Destroy up. But now they're starting to struggle in other modes, and that's how it can sometimes be in Call of Duty. You rise in one thing, and it's going to affect something else because you're focusing on it more in practice. But Hardpoint, they're 4-4 versus 31-20 before. So even their Hardpoint, they're going 50% in it,
And
But
let
it's
me just
slipping.
say, I'm not sure what's going on recently with them, but they need to return to like their bread and butter, and that is Lamar's in the hill and Pred is roaming.
I've seen Pred get a minute in hill.
I'm seeing Pred with a minute in the hill, and I'm like, yeah, oh, he's a team player. No.
Get him out of that fucking
Lamar
hill.
needs to be in the hill because that's the way this team thrives. Pred's going to go run and gun and slay. Sib is one of the most talented flexes in the league. He can drop 40 at any given moment. And I do think Mack is their X factor. I do hold Mack to a high standard. I think he's getting a lot of flack recently, and I can't lie, it's kind of deserved. I mean, he's been
warranted.
He's been underperforming recently, but he plays the game fundamentally correct. He helps his teammates on the map. He sets them up correctly.
It's a really strange turn of events with this team because they should be way better than they are. I think in theory they won an event last year in Toronto, it must be said, at Major 3 last season, and statistically they've been falling off. I mean, they got bodied the other day by Toronto, right? A swift 3-0. Mack on an individual level has been struggling despite accuracy turning up. Pred has still been Pred, and Sib has been more inconsistent, I would say, than he was at the start of the year. The start of the season, he was consistently dropping big numbers in the respawns. Now that's not quite the case. So I don't know what Surge do going forwards. It's been a discussion for a long time now that changes should have been made here that were frankly never made. And there were a lot of questions from the coaching staff around, Mack and accuracy get undeserved hate, which I think can be a fair point. But as Method says, some criticism is definitely justified on those players. And of course, they've got Gwyn, right, who's their substitute player on the roster. He's been frying in challenges, and it's interesting to debate that, whether bringing him in just to give it a go, because is this team of 4 going to win champs, right? I think it's very, very unlikely right now. So what is fundamentally the goal of a lot of these teams? The teams that are in the 5th through 8th region, as Seattle Surge presently are they just there to try and get 4th or to try and get 3rd? Or are they there to actually try and win? Because most teams this season, the teams at the top that have made changes, OpTic made a change, they improved drastically. Toronto made a change, they won the very next event they played. So, I don't know, it's interesting. Maybe they can't get a player they want, Surge, they wanted to make a move, but I'm still surprised they're doing so because they're down at 180 points. Like, their map win percentage is 51%. They're 17 in 17 in series. It's so far behind the teams they should be trying to compete with, theoretically, given the talent they've got on their roster. They're closer to Boston than they are to anybody else above them. And obviously, in the standings so far, they're getting cooked. I mean, okay, they lost to Toronto 0-3, but it's not a great start for Surge because they have some not exactly easy games to come, but, it's a little bit tricky for them from now to the rest of the stage. So, interesting to see. And obviously, they're absolutely nowhere near being in the conversation for qualifying for the World Championship, which these 4 teams have. And I believe that Subliners, also have, because Subliners at 235, I'm pretty sure there's no way they can't make it anymore. So I'm pretty sure New York have also qualified. But that might take 1 or 2 more games for the CDL to fully confirm. Also wanted to mention then this from Dan Ghosty. So GA the Vaznev, he reckons. So this is a very interesting talking point, not just for the present time, but also going forwards. It's always a big discussion at the start of a particular game's life cycle. What guns are too good? We know the M4 at the start of this game had to go. It was way too strong. There was too many of them on the map. So they settled on the TAC, right, or the SCAR, and the Vaznev 9K on the SMG side. There was also the Kastov 74U that was the do-it-all at the start of the game. They got rid of that one as well. But right now it's been Vaznev SCAR for a long time, and frankly, it's a decent 2-weapon meta. I don't think there's one that's particularly dominant over the other. Last year, there was some debate between the MP40 and the Auto. What was the better gun? Most people probably would have said the Auto. This year, I would say most would say the Vaznev is better. It fries at close range. It doesn't really have any recoil for longer range, and it's definitely a great SMG. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But you still will see 2 SCARs for most teams on most maps. I mean, how often is Ghosty using the Vaznev? Not particularly often, right? And obviously, Ghosty wants it gone. Okay, he wants it gone to some degree. Probably it's slightly in jest, because if he was to get rid of it, then would it actually help OpTic? I don't know. But then again, if there's a replacement for the Vaznev that would come in, it more than likely going to be the MP7, right, or the Vel or whatever it's called, that Shotzzy has been using to great effect in some ranked play games over the last few weeks. So if the Vaznev was to suddenly disappear from the meta and they decided to get rid of it, Shotzzy might not be too mad about that eventuality. But obviously, if you're OpTic and if you're the other teams at the top, you don't necessarily want to switch up the meta from what's currently happening, and I doubt there's any world in which they manage to get 9 of the 12 teams to agree to this, even if many of the AR players do agree, because Octane in the replies also said says, like, on God, it's got to go type thing. And this is always a thing that AR players will generally do. But of course, Ghosty's more in that flex role, technically, like Dashy being the main, even though realistically he's using the Scar as Dashy is the vast majority of the time. And that Scar does also melt, right? The attack also completely melts through. If you ever watch Dashy's POV, you'll certainly know that to be true. But it's interesting going into next season, especially because I knew that these blueprints were coming for a long time now, and there was definitely points where I was concerned that they would either nerf the Vaznev or it would be so good it would get like banned by the pros, and then all these blueprints that have been in the works for months would now therefore be irrelevant. So thankfully they arrived into the game to such a point that the Vaznev had actually still a weapon to use and therefore is still viable. But next season, what meta are you going to see? Because the current rumor is that we're going to have basically Modern Warfare 2.5, right? It's going to be this year's title, but then I think Sledgehammer are going to come in and they're going to drop a fantastic update, which is basically all the new maps. And I don't know what's going to change. I don't know what they're going to be able to do here to sell it as a new title, but I think it's probably going to be the same story again. But this is the thing, next year, what maps are we playing on? What guns are we using? Because I really don't think we want the game to be the same as it was before. The problem is, though, that many of these pro teams, especially the good ones, will like it as it is. And will they want drastic changes if the game is effectively the same for next year? Probably not. Although from a fan perspective, I think it would be very, imperative in a way to see something drastically different, because every single year we usually get a very different game. And imagine if we went into next year again, and okay, thankfully Fortress Control is gone, but next season starts whenever it's going to start later this year, sometime probably quite late this year. And map 1 again, we load into, Mikado Hardpoint, and then we play Fortress Search and Destroy map 2. Like, I'm not really too bothered about seeing that again for another season, especially if it's Vaznev's and Tact in action. So I imagine that this new game overhaul, whatever they do, will massively switch up the weapon meta that's going to be played with. Hopefully we'll add in way more maps, and the pros can at least, revolutionize the map pool to a certain extent. Maybe certain map mode combinations stay in, maybe Expo Control stays, hopefully Hotel stays in all the game modes and stuff like that, but hopefully there's some serious alterations. And yeah, if next season we're playing with a different AR and maybe the Vel instead, I think that'd be a quite nice way to switch up the way the game feels, even if fundamentally we're playing the same game. But for now, of course, to the World Championship, nothing's going to change from a meta perspective, but down the line, Ghosty and others might already have their plan prepared in terms of getting the Vaznev out of there in the off-season and then moving forward with something slightly different. Just before we close out here, wanted to mention this from Jacob Hale. Who is the most underrated player in the CDL right now, in your opinion? He comes up with 4 ideas: Vickle, Awakening, Priester, and I guess this is Accuracy. Of course, we've got Mack sitting right behind it. Maybe even Pred's underrated if you guys think he's just way better than even people think that he is. Some interesting options. I do agree that Vickle is probably underrated. Now, I wouldn't really say he's most underrated, because to me, most underrated is a player on a team that's doing particularly well and is not getting the credit they deserve on said team. Vickle is doing a great job, and I think probably is underrated by the community, but Florida still aren't doing much, are they? Let's be honest here. So same thing with the story like Nasty. People rate Nasty, I think, pretty well, and maybe he is underrated, but London still aren't doing much. I know the first name a lot of people mentioned on this was Envoy, right? And I think that's honestly kind of justified. We saw earlier today that Envoy over the last few years has been the 5th best player on average in the Breaking Point Power Rankings over the last couple of seasons, and yet he's still probably the one that gets arguably the least love on that Thieves team, despite being probably at a straight up superstar status. But then again, everyone in the Reddit thread was saying Envoy, and when everyone's saying Envoy, I'm like, is he really underrated? If everyone in the community thinks he's underrated, he's probably fairly rated if that's the case. So it's an interesting debate. I saw the rotation saying that Hicksy is probably, I think, should be up there as well in the conversation, given they did just win an event Toronto, and Hicksy was obviously a part of the reason why that was the case. I would also probably throw in a player like Skies. I feel like Skies has always been a player that is way better and can slay out way more heavily than he gets credit for. So, I always think Skies has been slightly overlooked over the last few years. Did win an event this year on the subliners, and it's been one of the key reasons why they had a good week last time out. So I'd throw him into the mix as well, but very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.